Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our latest episode of the Impact Series hosted by 40. My name's Michael. I'm one of the co-founders here at 40 and lead recruiter. And today, thrilled to be joined by Julian Kakarott, who is the CEO at fantastic company called CarbonStack. So welcome, Julian.
Hi, very happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Now, look, obviously, we've had a discovery call. You've told me lots of cool things about yourself and the business. But for those people that are watching this, that perhaps the first time they've heard of yourself and heard of the business, can you give us a brief introduction about perhaps yourself, where the idea for CarbonStack came from, and also the the unique approach that yourselves have to to addressing kind of the climate issues we're facing.
Sure, no problem. So CarbonStack, we're based in Germany. We're based in Hamburg. I studied engineering here, so I'm an engineer. Basically afterwards, I worked also at the university as a research associate. And basically, I was researching about different climate policies, so emission trading, voluntary carbon markets, and so on, and obviously also about technical solutions, both software and hardware, to basically cope with those climate challenges and those possible solutions. And that is also the background of CarbonStack. So basically, we founded the company in 2021, straight out of the university. Basically, our idea was to look at ecosystems, and we were a little bit confused basically about the entire issue of greenwashing and how do companies use ecosystems to offset emissions and so on. Because if you look at the climate reports from the IPCC and so on, it becomes obvious that we need to increase carbon uptake by ecosystems, have carbon offsets and carbon credits on all of that. But on the same side, it's very intransparent. It's very hard to predict actually the uptake ecosystems will have, especially in times of climate change. And we were basically looking for a technical solution, as engineers do, like how do we basically solve nature, if you want so. And so what we did was we developed, or we still develop software that helps both companies and very big landowners to basically simulate and analyze the ecosystems. And I think a major issue is at the moment that if you look at those projects and if you look at afforestation, basically you predict or values from the past, so what you've measured over the last 50, 100, 150 years, and basically use that as prediction into the future. If you look at certain tree species, certain locations, and so on. And that has worked very well in the past, but now that climate is changing, it's changing so rapidly, those predictions just they are not reality anymore. And so companies trying to figure out, landowners are trying to figure out what kind of tree species will we have in which locations in 50 years, 70 years, 100 years, and how much carbon can they store, what about biodiversity, water uptake, and so on, all those factors. And we are basically developing software to analyze all of that and basically simulate the cycles, the biological cycles inside the ecosystems.
Okay, brilliant. And it's providing the software and simulations, right, about how those forests behave, how they would, and it often being the ability to kind of make those dynamic and adjusting for different climate factors and different climate scenarios as well. Is that correct?
Exactly. So basically, landowners and companies are basically entering forest areas into our platform. We then have, on the one hand, we gather a lot of data. So we gather a lot of weather data, radiation data, soil data, remote sensing data, everything that you basically can imagine. And that also on, weather data, for instance, on a daily basis, remote sensing data every few months, and so on. And so we gather all that data, and then we have our simulations that basically look at the different locations and simulate different climate scenarios. So if you look at the locations, for instance, and you gather all the weather and soil data, you can tell, okay, what kind of basically place are we talking about? What kind of tree species should grow there? And then you look at climate scenarios, and then you predict basically based on statistics, okay, how is the climate, the weather going to change over the next few decades? and based on that, you can make predictions, and that is basically then our software solution.
Okay, so you're making predictions, but it's and I think when we discussed this as well, so it's about the environmental simulation, but there's also a verification element to the business as well, right?
That is correct, right? So if you talk about afforestation projects, and especially in the carbon credit field, it is essential to basically look at those areas over the project duration. And the project duration can be very long, especially for those nature-based solution projects. So that means that we have project durations of roughly 30 years for most projects, sometimes maybe even longer. And so you have to do a checkup, ideally every year, sometimes every 2 or 3 years, to basically check up on nature and see, okay, how's the project going? Do we actually hit our targets? Is the forest behaving differently than we expected, or is the weather behaving differently than we expected? And that has an impact on the nature and so on. And we are basically looking at that over the entire time frame.
Oh, okay. And so what's the typical user case for this then, Julian? So who are your typical customers? Who's typically going to be using your software and using your solution?
Sure. We're looking basically at two large groups, I would say. One group is landowners, especially larger landowners. So basically companies that want to figure out how do I optimize my estate over a long period of time. And those companies have to make very long-term decisions. So usually in a company you have like maybe 5-year goals, very ambitious, maybe 10-year goals, and so on. But those forest companies, they have targets over 50 and 100 years. And so decisions you make today have a huge impact on your future business case. And so we are trying to basically figure out how do we do the science behind the scenes to actually make better decisions than in the companies. And the second part, as mentioned, we're working with companies on carbon crediting projects. And I think the major issue there is that on the one hand, you have a trust issue. So a lot of people don't trust, especially nature-based projects where you make predictions and you say, okay, today I'm going to start this project, I'm investing into it, and then credits are going to come out of it over 30 years. And who knows if the forest is still there in 100 years, maybe. And so we have to basically do the science behind the scenes and figure out what are the likely scenarios, what's the risk, and so on. And then also from a business case perspective, right? Because if you as a company, you invest in those projects, you want to know how many credits do I get over which time frame. And with the current methods, it's just not very accurate. And so if you want to do a lot of projects, and we do need a lot of projects, especially when we look at Germany, and with like 500,000 hectares of really dead forest, we need the accuracy and the models to actually make good business cases.
And so is it, in terms of the customers and the user base, are these I'm assuming that for some part, the forest owners, obviously these forests, a lot of them already exist, obviously already in place, and then you're able to kind of look at scenarios in terms of the weather patterns, etc., make predictions. You mentioned the corporates as well. So is it okay for the corporates that already have these initiatives in place? They're already kind of planting forests, planting trees, or is this also as a planning tool? So where companies or people are actually going out to look to reforest, and actually so you can kind of help with a prediction towards these trees will we think that you should plant this sort of tree, this sort of mix of trees, because in the next 30 years it's likely to produce a much better crop or much better carbon sequestration.
All of those things actually. So, and it also depends. So it depends on the case. What do you actually want to achieve? And it also depends on the location. So as I mentioned, in Germany, for instance, the biggest issue right now is actually just forest deaths. So you do see a lot of droughts, you see a lot of pests, and so the forests are just dying. And so you need to basically think about the next generation of forest. And so it's mainly about reforestation. So you have those large areas that are damaged, and you need to figure out, okay, clearly the forest in the past didn't work, so what am I going to do next? And I think the potential for mistakes is big because you have this changing climate. And if you try to do something similar as the last time, you probably end up maybe with a forest that grows very well over 20 years maybe, but then you don't have enough water for it because it's very water intensive or something like that. Then it stops dying again. Then you have the same problem in 30 years. So you have to figure out what are the actual factors. And then you have, different use cases in different countries. For maybe also in Europe, you have countries that don't actually have this magnitude of problems, but they might want to figure out, okay, how do we actually prevent this from happening? So because climate is changing and it's gonna be there eventually for everybody, and so they have to figure out, okay, what trends do we see in other countries and how can we actually rebuild our forest already? And then it often comes also in either afforestation or reforestation of areas that have been used for timber production and so on, and we try to support that.
Very cool indeed.
Yeah.
And so I know your focus initially has been is very much German centric. What does the future hold? What does the future look like in terms of territories? Where your software, where your solutions can be put in place.
Yes. So basically, what we're developing at CarbonStack is deep understanding of ecosystems, and so for us, it's easier to actually implement the solution in areas where we already have that understanding. And so we feel very comfortable in Europe. So we, as you said, we started in Germany, but we don't see issues implementing the solution in other European countries because the climate is similar. Obviously you have differences, and you also have differences in soil and so on, but still it's it's a simulation, and basically we vary the input factors. Same would probably also go for North America. We haven't tested that yet, but again, climate is similar, so you can draw those comparisons, and the processes are comparable. And that is basically where we are headed. And so then you look at maybe the global south or other areas, and then we would have to develop new models for those ecosystems. But that's also our goal. So basically, we want to add step by step different ecosystems in order to then eventually have models that can basically cope with all kinds of different ecosystems.
Nice. Okay. And look, it seems like you've done a lot in a short space of time already, Julian. So you founded the company in 2021. So I mean, what stage is the business at the moment? Where are you at in terms of things like funding, headcount, and also, I mean, look, and then if we were to fast forward in say 3 to 5 years, what do you think the company might look like at that point?
Sure. As mentioned, we started in Germany. We are now starting our first project outside of Germany, so in other European countries. We have 11 people right now, so we're still, I would say, a small team, but we are expanding. And basically, as you mentioned, we were founded in 2021. We worked with a lot of universities during that time. Also in Germany, that's, I think, a very common thing to do, to actually start off out of the university. And then I think in 2022, we did a lot of development of the software, of the solution, and actually figuring out like how is the solution going to work. And now we're really at the phase where we start, as I mentioned, expanding also outside of Germany, and we start to really nail down what are all the value propositions that we can probably enable based on the simulations that we have written over the past 1.5 years.
And have you got any kind of metrics in place, Julian? Any kind of goals, targets in terms of the amount of hectares of forest that you're able to monitor or you're predicting on?
Yeah.
That might be a metric I've made up, but you have any kind of metrics internally that you're kind of, in terms of your impact and the scale, is there anything like that you can share with us?
Sure. We're basically looking at 2 factors. One is, as you mentioned, hectares, basically, which is mainly we mainly look at afforestation, reforestation, and I would say we have a pipeline of 5-digit hectares of afforestation, reforestation already, which will be if you look at forests, it's a very slow process often because you do need the supply chain behind that. You need to wait for the seedlings and so on. So we make plans over roughly 10 years for that, actually. And then we also look at, obviously, the carbon uptake and what can we achieve over the project duration. And we do have, projects in the pipeline that go way into the millions of tons of carbon uptake. And so we are looking at that, and that's obviously a long-term goal. So it's going to be over 30 years and longer. but we are adding projects, basically day by day to increase that number.
Brilliant. I mean, they're big headline numbers. Millions of millions of tons of carbon. That's the quicker we, and the more people I speak to, where we're talking numbers in those kinds of impact, that's sort of in the millions. Hopefully we can turn around this climate emergency.
And I think what's important is to actually make that measurable. I think especially if you look at Germany and I would say Europe in general, probably companies are often doing kind of like tree planting events and so on, sometimes with employees and so on. It's often not very it's not measured actually what the impact of that is, and often it's not enough to just plant a few trees, but you actually have to make planning for that. You have to figure out what do you want to achieve with those projects, and then also monitor those over an appropriate time frame. And I think that is something that companies are understanding now, and where we are really trying to help actually make those decisions and enable the companies to actually understand nature, although probably their core business is way outside of that.
Yeah. Well, we touched on this before in our last conversation, but there's a big European reform, right? Where there's now a framework in which companies are needing to effectively report on their climate and their impact as well. So do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Because I found that really interesting, and obviously that seems that kind of this new litigation, this new framework seems like it could be a really big opportunity for you as a business to, because obviously more it's one of the factors that that really kind of helps to potentially drive business forward is kind of compliance and rules and regulations. So it could well be that that your solution is right place, right time as well, Julian.
Sure. Yeah, I remember we talked about the corporate sustainability reporting last time, which now with the new directive that the EU has issued, basically, you always had large companies that were basically reporting their environmental targets, but now it will also apply to mid-sized companies, and that makes a huge difference. So I think in the EU alone, it's like 50,000 companies that have to report. I think probably starting 2025, 2026. So they already prepare for that. So we do see that. So a lot of companies now actually start drafting those reports because they know it's going to be mandatory at some point. And I think a lot of companies don't want to do it like for the first time when it becomes mandatory, but they want to basically do a test run of that prior to this. And so we do see companies that come to us that already have reported, their environmental goals and measures, although they didn't have to. But now new companies are coming, which basically see the directive on the horizon and say, okay, now we have to actually start reporting and taking this serious. And I think it makes a big difference. I think what you always have to mention is that those companies, they just have to report how sustainable they are. They don't have to be sustainable actually, but I think this transparency still makes a big difference. Because now basically everybody can look at those companies and say, hey, your website is very green, but your reporting says something different, and so that makes a big difference.
Well, I mean, and that's important. So there's a huge amount of talk about greenwashing. We know it's been a problem for a long time, but that we were just talking about it before as well, in loosely terms. But there is a real problem with companies using the kind of green or climate neutral tags. That really this is I think while they don't need to be sustainable, they have to report on their sustainability. It certainly encourages you to actually think, well, we need to be have a much more robust sustainability effort and policy.
And I think what's important is that this is going to be part of the financial reporting, and so there's going to be a similar due diligence to that as for the financial reporting. And so I think that makes probably the biggest difference, because companies take their financial reporting very serious. And so in the future, they will also take their sustainability reporting very serious. And that I think is probably the major factor.
Yeah, I think it's a great initiative because, like I say, because it's going to be out there in the public domain, it's going to force a lot of companies to seriously think or rethink their strategy around it. And that, and also as consumers, depending, like you said, you could, a consumer could look, if they were that way inclined and they wanted to actually see, well, who am I buying my goods from? What impact are they making? That gives the consumer the option to say, well, actually, I don't want to deal with that company. I'm X company. I want to deal with Y because they're a lot more sustainable and they've made a much, there's a much better impact. So I think, that can only be a positive thing. Hopefully for yourself, Julian, with CarbonStack and your business, you're in the, in a great position to help, lots of companies, small enterprises, large enterprises, and of course, startups and scale ups as well, to kind of, to help with their sustainability journey and their, and their ESG targets as well. So look, Julian, I mean, look, that kind of, I think, kind of brings us towards the end of the episode now. Look, it's been fantastic to have you on. I'll give you one, before we finish up though, one last opportunity to say, like, if there's anything that you kind of want to put out there in terms of, what's kind of coming up in the future, or if there's anything for people to kind of, keep an eye out for on your LinkedIn feed. Three.
Yeah, I think that would be good. I mean, I already mentioned it, that we are starting our first project outside of Germany, and I can't talk about specifics because it's not official yet, but it might be worth it to follow me then on LinkedIn and basically look at the updates, because we are very excited to actually, as I mentioned, we want to bring our technology to Europe and actually enhance European forests as our primary goal at the moment. And so we are very excited about expanding in other countries as well, and basically bringing our value to those countries, because we see that every country has its own issues. It's very, very interesting, because we do have a very similar ecosystem, but the challenges are different. And actually to be able to help us is very exciting.
Yeah. Well, and look, obviously, if you can take it beyond Germany into lots of, as many countries as possible, it's just gonna, every little helps, and they're all intertwined. So forest, within the Germany, the climate, it impacts everything, and it's now more evident than it ever has been that that climate change is a real thing. Filming this. It's early in the year already, and we're certainly where I'm at the moment, we've been hitting temperatures over 30 degrees, which is unheard of, certainly for London at this time of year. So look, but it's Julian, it's been a real pleasure in speaking with you again today. We'll tag you in. We'll obviously include a link to your LinkedIn profile in the comments, so people can get in touch, follow you, connect with you. And I really appreciate your time today, Julian.